This podcast is Challenging Opinions and is presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading the Challenging Opinions podcast for July 30th, 2018. We take it for granted that in the West, with a few minor exceptions, people can worship or not worship whatever way they want. It's not like that the world over. In this podcast, I'll talk to the head of an organisation dedicated to helping persecuted Christians.
Challenging Opinions is the podcast where ideas are tested. Whether you are left or right, conservative or progressive, devout or skeptic. What matters is the strength of your argument, not the strength of your voice.
And coming up for you in this podcast, the Good Samaritan didn't ask what was the religion of the person that he was helping. Shouldn't we help people who are persecuted no matter what their beliefs?
Oh, absolutely. However, I represent a Roman Catholic institution called Aid of the Church in Need. Our job is to help, our mission is to help persecuted and suffering Christians throughout the world.
That's coming up shortly, but first, if you like the podcast, remember that I now have a Patreon account, which is to raise some money to justify me putting more of my time and effort into research and finding guests. So if you can afford to contribute $1 or $2, I'd really appreciate that. Links and details are on the website. I don't normally talk about certain figures. I've mentioned not mentioning the T word, or at least not mentioning it too often before, and there's a few other highly polarizing figures such as Jordan Peterson and Milo Yiannopoulos that I tend to stay away from. One reason is because they are so polarizing. As far as I can see, there are some things that both of them say that are obviously correct. There are other things that they say that are obvious nonsense. But they have such a strong hold over their followers, not to mention a strong hold over their detractors, that everything they say is parsed and analysed to death, so there's not much more for me to say about it. But I recently heard a clip of a speech by Jordan Peterson where I think he made a point that he hadn't made before, at least not quite so often as the handful of points that he normally makes, and I think it's a good point. It's something that hadn't occurred to me before in this form.
We have a problem. We know how to put a box around the extremists on the right. Basically, we say, oh, you're making claims of ethnic or racial superiority. You're not part of the conversation anymore. What do we do on the left? Nothing. That's not good, because there's an issue. Can the left go too far? Yes. When? Oh, we don't know. Oh, that's not a very good answer.
Leaving aside Peterson's love of asking himself questions and then answering them as though he was some sort of genius, and his style of shouting out statements as though someone was trying to interrupt him, this is a good point. There are people at all points of the political spectrum. Half of them, by definition, are more right-wing than average. Only the dumbest left-winger would dispute the point that there are perfectly reasonable and intelligent people who take a conservative position. And only the dumbest right-winger would dispute the point that, at some point in the spectrum, there's a line beyond which it's not possible to debate with people in the normal democratic way. That doesn't mean you can't talk to racists or Nazis. I might have done that myself. But you can't discuss the benefits of this or that economic policy in the same tone that you can discuss whether all human beings are entitled to be treated on an equal basis. You can discuss the merits of single-payer healthcare in the way that you just can't discuss whether anti-Semitism is justified because the Jews killed Jesus. And if you think you can, well then, talk to Jeff Foxworthy. Peterson is correct that racism provides a clear, sharp line beyond which people on the right cannot go if they want to be accepted in polite society. And he's correct that there's no such widely accepted dividing line as you go leftwards on the political spectrum. You can say that publicly funded grade schools are a good thing for society. That's about the mildest form of advocating a socialised cost. Or you can defend the murderous policies of Stalin, Mao and Pol Pot. It's clear that at some point you can get so far to the left that your views cannot be taken seriously in a democratic society, but it's not really clear where that point is. And Peterson is right that this is a problem in that it means we don't have a litmus test for whether someone on the left is a Democrat or not. But Peterson, not for the first time, is blind to a whole series of problems with his own idea. First of all, how clear is that litmus test on the right? People on the far right are hardly unaware of this shibboleth. They know that if they go into overtly racist or anti-Semitic territory, they are, as Peterson himself said, out of the conversation. But that doesn't stop them from winking at people who they think secretly share their secret-ish racist views. I mentioned Milo Yiannopoulos earlier. He insists that he's not a racist, but a leaked set of his emails shows that he didn't write much of the stuff that was published under his name. He had a ghostwriter do it. And he didn't come up with many of the ideas either. When he was writing for Breitbart, he was in daily contact with explicitly racist and neo-Nazi figures. They would feed him ideas. He would forward the emails to his ghostwriter with instructions on exactly how far to go when pushing the ideas of those racists and neo-Nazis. It's clear from their exchanges that they pulled back from some opinions, particularly anti-Semitic ones, not because they disagreed with them, but because they wanted to stay on the right side of Peterson's line. That said, Peterson isn't responsible for policing that line, and it remains true that this line exists and is useful, even if people are deceptive about what side of it they fall on. But hang on, Peterson says that there are some extremes of leftism that are unacceptable in a democracy, and those extremes are unacceptable, even if the dividing line is poorly demarcated. And this is where we come to Peterson's total lack of self-awareness. He's critical of the left for not ostracizing their undemocratic fellow travellers. But day after day, in speech after speech, in YouTube video after YouTube video, Peterson classifies everyone to the left of himself as a Marxist. He sees every problem in society, every moral failing, every broken home, every life wasted in idleness, every slight, real or imagined, as being caused by his absurdly broad, catastrophist definition of Marxism. He's right to point out that some on the left are morally blind to the undemocratic fringe of their movement. They refuse to see the fly in the ointment. But Peterson's observation that there must be a division between democracy and despotism makes all the more astounding his own unshakable belief that everyone to the left of him is equally responsible for the downfall of his view of social order. For Peterson, there is no ointment, only fly.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you want your point of view heard, email podcast@challengingopinions.com and say what you think.
On the line now, I have George Marlin. George served 2 terms as Executive Director and CEO of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. That's the landlord of the World Trade Center. But he also wrote a book called Christian Persecutions in the Middle East, a 21st Century Tragedy. George, why did you write the book?
Well, I have the privilege of being chair of an international Catholic organization under the guidance of the Pope called Aid of the Church in Need, and we have been dedicated for over half a century to helping persecuted and suffering Christians throughout the world. And for obvious reasons, in recent years, our emphasis has been towards the Middle East, where there has been tremendous suffering. So we have people on the ground who not only working for us, providing humanitarian services, etc., they're also giving us a pretty good idea of what has been going on, particularly during the period when ISIS was controlling significant pieces of territory in the Middle East. So I gathered that data and turned it into a book called Christian Persecutions of the Middle East, describing what was going on. So my purpose was to remind the West in particular, and the United States, which is part of the West, where I'm an American, that the unthinkable is real. and that there is systematic persecutions, I would argue genocide, which the United States finally conceded in the last year of the Obama administration, that there was indeed Christian persecution and persecution towards other minorities in the Middle East.
Do you mean specifically under ISIS?
Well, specifically under ISIS, what we're going through right now, the destruction and the driving out of people. What we're meeting is millions of displaced people, which has happened primarily under ISIS over the last few years. So we're providing the humanitarian aid. I wanted to get that message out because a lot of what was going on, one did not read in the New York Times or the London Times, or, it really wasn't hitting the screen of the West. And I am contributing, I hope, to getting that message out, and I think succeeded to a certain extent.
Okay. As well as ISIS, there are countries, and I think of Saudi Arabia, also Turkey, where there's very considerable limitations on Christian practice of Christianity and how Christians are allowed to lead their lives. These are countries that are allied to the United States. Should US foreign policy be more muscular about protecting not just Christians, but all religious minorities in these countries?
Well, first of all, in my book itself, part 2, which I call The Unthinkable in the 21st Century, I focus in on Turkey, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Sudan and South Sudan, to give an idea of how Christians are being persecuted in each of those countries. I'm not here to play a Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, or anyone else. I understand realpolitik to a certain extent, but that does deny that there's Christian persecutions going on in Saudi Arabia, for instance, where you have hundreds of thousands of Filipinos, for instance, who work in the oil fields there, and they're not allowed to have a church. They're treated as second-rate citizens and treated like dirt for the most part, and I think it's morally wrong.
Sure, and I should just give some description of that, because, for example, in Saudi Arabia, people who are typically guest workers in Saudi Arabia are checked out by the religious police to make sure that they're not wishing each other happy Christmas, to make sure that their kids aren't having a Christmas concert. This is very, very rigorous and very oppressive treatment. And even if you go to Turkey, which is a moderate country, even is billed as a moderate Islamic country, in order to get to build a church, you must get permission even to repair the church. And this can be made into a horribly long and bureaucratic process, so the churches are literally falling down.
I get into that in my book as well. And in Turkey, for instance, as you know, from the Treaty of Lausanne back after the First World War, it's the Orthodox Christians that are recognized in particular. So if a Catholic bishop is there, he can't open a checking account, can't open a church. So yes, there's no doubt about it, Christian persecution, where Big Brother, the state itself, has spies out there and wandering around and making sure no one gets off the reservation there. So yes, it's throughout to say, listen, what we're seeing in terms of systematic persecution, what I mean by that is not only people that the cover of my book is the picture of ISIS, the ISIS people about ready to cut off the heads of the Coptic Christians, that famous picture that came out. But it also includes second-class citizenship, forced conversion, job discrimination, education discrimination, bombing of churches, particularly around high holy days, the murdering of priests, the abductions of murdering of bishops, the destructions of Christians' homes and businesses by mobs. We had a Pakistani archbishop over in the United States last year. And one story that stuck in my mind, there were several Christian husband and wife who had a Bible. They had to have a Bible in a particular part of Pakistan. The husband worked making bricks the old-fashioned way, where they put them in the ovens and flame the ovens. There was a mob that came to his house, yanked out he and his wife, and they were thrown alive into these ovens. So these are the kind of horror stories you don't read in the New York Times every day. So we're able to gather this information, and more important, bring it to the general public. And just as important, we have been raising tens of millions of dollars a day to the church in need to provide, basic emergency aid. We're rehabilitating houses now for safe dwelling in the Nineveh Plain with ISIS being driven out. We're rebuilding communities.
You mentioned a story about a cheesemaker.
Oh, the cheesemaker. Well, here's an interesting thing. A couple of years ago, we had a Syrian bishop who came over, and after hearing the descriptions of the horrors of ISIS on his Christian flock, I looked at him and said, what do you need right now? What can I get for you tomorrow that will help your mission and help your flock. And he looked at me and said, I need a cheese-making machine. And I was like, what are we talking about here? And he said, no, there are a significant number of my flock that are living in the mountains, the border mountains between Syria and Lebanon. Winter is here. They have their goats. They're living off the land, and I need a cheese-making machine and a generator. It costs like $25,000, $30,000. We got it for him. But the point is, when you ask a bishop, what is your most pressing need? And he says, a cheese-making machine. That tells you something. He's down there with his flock who are living off the land, trying just to survive. They left their homes with the shirts on their back and nothing else. And we are trying to help these people. And quite frankly, I'm proud to say to the Church in Need, more than any other Christian institution in the world, we have done the most for providing humanitarian aid to the Christian refugees. And, you know, one thing that should be pointed out, even though there has been international aid going into those areas, particularly from the United Nations, most of it goes to refugee camps that are generally populated by Muslims, and Christians are afraid to go there, fearing for their lives. So it has been the institutional church, through the institutional church, organizations like Aid of the Church in Need, the Knights of Columbus, and others, have been providing the dollars needed to buy the basic humanitarian aid for day-to-day survival. So that's our mission, and I'm proud to say we've done a lot.
That sounds like, excellent work, and I can understand why you'd be proud of that. But there's one part of the tone of this sometimes that makes me uneasy, and I'm sure you'd agree, and you're aware that Christians are persecuted in the Middle East in very serious ways. However, the majority of people, just because they are the majority of people who are persecuted, are very often Muslims. And sometimes in the West, that type of discourse can feed a narrative that almost says that, well, we should be persecuting Muslims back in revenge. What's your view on that?
That's a new one to me. I don't see it at all. I'm dealing with facts, and as one of the writers of the Declaration of Independence, co-authored John Adams, second president of the United States, said, facts are stubborn things. So I'm dealing with facts of what is happening to the Christians at this point in time, has been happening over the last couple of years, and we're helping them out. In terms of revenge, I don't see any of that. I don't think anybody sees anything about it.
Okay.
So,
well, I've seen, for example,
as a Christian institution, helping out Christians, and I don't see any revenge. I see people that are wondering where they're going to get their next meal tomorrow. Are they going to have a roof over their head tomorrow? Will their kids be able to get vaccines that they need? They're worried about survival. And we're doing whatever we can to help them survive and help them retain the Christian heritage that has been in the Middle East for 2,000 years.
And it should be said, most of these countries, all of these countries are majority Muslim, but they have Christian minorities who are ethnically from those areas. It's not like they're people who moved from somewhere else. They've, for centuries, had Christian and Jewish minorities in almost every city across the Middle East, and that's been under threat in recent years. But one thing I saw, and I want to emphasize, this isn't connected with you, but I want to get your opinion on it. A figure put out by the Center for the Study of Global Christianity claimed that there were 100,000 Christian martyrs per year. And people who repeated that claim online then made the claim that this was 100,000 Christian martyrs killed by Muslims per year. Now, this was investigated very thoroughly by the BBC, and it seems entirely wrong. But you can see where I'm coming from on this, that there seems to be, there are bigots on all sides, and there are people who, in the right circumstances or maybe the wrong circumstances, would do bad things. And those people exist on all sides. The Good Samaritan didn't ask what was the religion of the person that he was helping. Is it good that we're concentrating so much on Christian persecution? Shouldn't we help people who are persecuted no matter what their beliefs?
Oh, absolutely. However, I represent a Roman Catholic institution called Aid of the Church in Need. Our job is to help, our mission is to help persecuted and suffering Christians throughout the world. We are helping Christians in India right now that are being persecuted by Hindus. Okay, so it's just not isolated instances. There's persecution and suffering going on throughout the world. I'm dealing with my mission, which is helping persecuted Christians.
I understand that, but would it not be better to open your doors to all?
Our mission is to help persecuted and suffering Christians. That's our mission. And that's what we raise money to do. That's our mission. There are hundreds and hundreds of other organizations out there that help other people, other religious sects. That's their job. I'm doing my job.
I understand. What inspired you to take up that job?
I've been on this board. I've been chairman of the board for a decade now. I've been on the board for about 20 years. The organization was founded in 1948 by a Norbertine priest by the name of Father Werefried van Straten. His original mission was to help suffering Christians on the dark side of the Iron Curtain. He was known as the Bacon Priest, literally back in the late 40s, going through Eastern Germany and Eastern Europe. He went with a wheelbarrow handing out slabs of bacon. Over the years, that institution grew, and with the fall of the Iron Curtain, we've expanded our mission to help suffering and persecutions Christians throughout the world. So I had met the founder some years ago. I was invited to join the board, which I was happy to do, and we've just done great service. Last year, we raised about $120 million, and we've been having projects all over the world. But for obvious reasons, during the rise of ISIS, we concentrated a great deal of our efforts and our treasures, so to speak, that we raised from individuals all around the world to help in the Middle East. But we are helping in countries all over the world where there are suffering Christians. And
obviously you're devoting that to sort of very practical, very physical aid. And you mentioned, I think it's a great story about the cheesemaker, and that's obviously following in the steps of the Bacon Priest.
Well, to give you an idea, here's what we've done. Okay, we've provided monthly food rations to people. We've supplied fuel to feed their shelters. We've given counseling. We brought doctors in. We have assisted in vaccinating and providing basic medical attention to children. We've built temporary schools to help those kids have a place to go to get educated. So there's education opportunities we have paid for. And now we're helping to rebuild their homes, rebuild their shops, rebuild their businesses in order to, make it habitable. Particularly right now we're emphasizing Nineveh Plains. We've done the same thing in Aleppo.
Tell the listeners where the Nineveh Plains are.
The Nineveh Plains are in northern Iraq, and that's an ancient Christian community there. We've been working with the Archbishop of Erbil, Wata. He's rebuilding a university there. We're rebuilding the schools, rebuilding the homes, because I agree with the Archbishop, who is of the opinion that Christians should be able to remain in their ancient homes and ancient lands. And sadly, if we do not help them out, we will reach a point where there'll be no Christians left in the Middle East. And I personally think that's wrong. So we're doing whatever we can, working with the archbishops, bishops, patriarchs in the regions to help maintain those people there. The Archbishop of Aleppo, Archbishop Jean Bart, for instance, started a program which we help support, where he's helping to rebuild the businesses. If you're a dentist, he'll buy you a dentist chair and help you rebuild your business again, or if you're a carpenter. So there's the humanitarian aid, and now we're doing the post-war aid of trying to rebuild those communities so Christians could live a normal life again.
And you've mentioned the post-war and the immediate emergency humanitarian aid. Do you get involved in lobbying or trying to persuade either the US government or local governments to essentially protect the communities there?
Well, I've personally written a number of op-eds and others. We have gone to Washington and signed. A number of members of Congress have put together statements to try to provide aid. Right now in the United States, the Trump administration has promised several $100 million of aid to the Middle East to help rebuild these communities. Vice President Pence just 2 weeks ago made a statement that commitment is firm, and sent over the person they appointed in charge of this program. I happen to know he's in the Middle East right now, surveying the areas there to see where help can be made. So, again, I've written op-ed pieces banging the pots and pans. I've urged the bishops of the United States to speak out on these issues, which they have. We have met with members of Congress. We're a C3, but which means we're a charity and we can't get involved in politics. But we can make public policy statements, and I've been doing that for the last couple of years. I've had pieces published in newspapers magazines throughout the United States.
In many countries in the Middle East and the wider Muslim world in particular, it's not completely irrational for people there to believe that they're being persecuted by the United States. Do you think that that prejudices the position of Christians locally?
I don't know. I'm an American. I'm a New Yorker. I was the landlord of the World Trade Center. I was executive director of the Port Authority in New York, New Jersey. An act of terrorism brought down those buildings and killed thousands of people. A number of them I knew, a number of them have worked for me. So as an American, we saw a terrorist act in this country, and it was quite disturbing. And unless you're a New Yorker, people don't understand what exactly happened that day. And for obvious reasons, I was very close to the situation. Mm-hmm. People who worked for me 20 years ago died in a command center that I built. So again, we in the United States have a particular view of the world. However, what I'm doing is acting as the head of a Christian institution, trying to raise money to help persecuted Christians. So that's my mission, and that's what I'm devoted on. I'm not in the foreign policy business. I'm a banker by background, so I'm not a foreign policy expert.
I understand, George. But if you were to take what you felt, and I know that it's very, very personal for you, and it was, a day that will live in infamy, to borrow a phrase. But and I'm thinking of a place called Haskamena in Afghanistan, where the US Air Force bombed a wedding party and killed dozens of people. Can you,
we're getting into an area now where listen, this is not an area I'm not going to get into. B, I'm not going to discuss the war. We're at war in Afghanistan, the United States, and things happen from time to time, but I'm not going to go into judging and dealing with every little situation you could bring up here. That's not what I'm going with. What's happening? Yes, you are. Please, let's move on. Okay, you want to move on? If not, we'll end this interview. Okay?
Absolutely. No, actually, what I'm asking for is, can you feel empathy for people in that situation?
I feel empathy for anybody who suffers in this world. War is horrible. Okay? Mm-hmm. Okay, it is very horrible. We fought something called the Second World War, and Great Britain and the United States was an ally of the Soviet Union.
That's right.
And I think Churchill said that if Hitler declared war on hell, he'd find a nice word to say about Satan. So war is irrational. War is evil by its very nature, and people get together to fight other enemies and then become enemies. Sadly, that's the history of mankind. So yes, I have deplored war. Is anybody deplore wars? They happen, though. And once again, they are facts, and facts are stubborn things. And the facts we have dealt with, what I have dealt with, and where I've tried to make a contribution is helping those Christians in the Middle East and countries throughout the world where Christians are suffering or being persecuted. So that's my mission. That's my specialty. That's what I work on.
And that's one thing that you have put a huge amount of energy into, I'm aware. George Marlin, author of Christian Persecutions in the Middle East, a 21st Century Tragedy, published by St. Augustine's Press. Thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Make your view heard. Email podcast@challengingopinions.com to set out your ideas and defend them on the next podcast.
Go to the website for sources and links to George's organization and his book. And while you're there, please like the show on Facebook, follow @ChallengingO on Twitter, and follow George's organization @ChurchInNeed, and get in touch with me if you can suggest a guest or topic for a future show. Also, you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. It's all at www.challengingopinions.com. And I have a Patreon account now, so if you would like to support the podcast, I'd really appreciate that. All of the details are on the website. The Challenging Opinions podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Thank you for listening.